For years, people laughed when Katt Williams said the quiet part out loud. They called him bitter, unhinged, a comedian spiraling for attention. But now, that laughter sounds nervous. Because the receipts are starting to line up and they're pointing straight at 50 Cent. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a tweet taken out of context. It was an edit. A very deliberate one. Somewhere between production meetings and final cuts, 7 powerful names vanished from the Diddy documentary. Not blurred. Not hinted at. Removed. Erased. Like they were never supposed to be there in the first place. And suddenly, Katt Williams doesn't look crazy anymore. He looks early. Because if this documentary was really about truth, why did certain names never make it to screen? Why were some connections explored in detail while others were quietly left on the cutting room floor? And more importantly, who decided what the public was allowed to know? The internet caught it fast. Screenshots, old interviews, side-by-side comparisons of what was teased versus what actually aired. And once people noticed what was missing, they couldn't stop looking. This wasn't just a documentary edit. It felt like damage control in HD. And once that realization hit, the story stopped being about Diddy. It became about who was protected, who was sacrificed, and why Katt Williams warned everyone long before the cameras ever rolled. At first, the documentary felt like a victory lap, polished, confident, marketed as truth finally getting daylight. The kind of project that tells viewers, this is the version you're allowed to see. And most people watched it exactly that way, as a controlled narrative, not a complete one. Because documentaries don't usually hide things unless there's a reason, and this one had gaps, not small ones. Not blink and you miss it moments. Big, uncomfortable absences. Names that should have come up. Faces that once hovered around the story but suddenly evaporated like they were never there. At first, people brushed it off. Editing happens. Time limits exist. Not everything makes the final cut. That excuse lasted about 5 minutes, because once people started comparing early teasers, interviews, and promotional language to what actually aired, the math stopped mathing. 7 powerful names, people long rumored to be connected, adjacent, or at least relevant, were nowhere to be found. No mention. No implication. No shadow on the wall, just silence, and silence is never accidental in projects like this. That's when Katt Williams' old words started resurfacing like they'd been bookmarked by time. Clips of him saying the industry protects its own, that certain people never get named, that the truth only goes so far before it hits money, power, and fear. Back then, people laughed. Now they replayed, because the more viewers revisited what Katt warned about, the more the documentary started to feel less like exposure and more like selective honesty. The kind that tells you enough to feel informed, but not enough to disrupt the system that benefits from staying intact. And then all eyes turned to 50 Cent, not because he was sloppy, because he was precise. Nobody believes someone at that level accidentally misses 7 powerful names. This wasn't a rushed YouTube video. This was a carefully constructed production with lawyers, producers, consultants, and clearance teams involved at every step. Every word vetted. Every image approved. Every mention weighed, which means every omission was weighed too. That's when the narrative shifted from what did the documentary reveal to what did it avoid. People started asking the uncomfortable questions. Who benefits from these names staying off screen? Who gets protected when certain connections aren't explored? And why did the project stop exactly where things would have gotten complicated? The sarcasm online turned sharp fast. People joked that the documentary had selective vision, that it was playing chess while pretending to play checkers, that it told the truth like a politician, technically honest, strategically incomplete. And while those jokes landed, the undertone was suspicion. Because suspicion grows when patterns appear. 7 names didn't disappear randomly. They vanished together. Not 1 or 2. Not questionable figures. Powerful ones. The kind of people whose presence would have changed the conversation entirely. The kind of people who make documentaries go from expose to lawsuit. And suddenly, the editing choices didn't feel creative. They felt protective. Katt Williams' warnings started sounding less like comedy and more like leaked memos delivered early. He'd said there were names nobody would touch, that people act brave until contracts get involved, that the industry pretends to love truth but panics when truth starts naming names. At the time, critics called him paranoid. Now critics were quiet because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was a visible absence, a noticeable silence where context should have lived. And once people see that, they can't unsee it. The documentary still hit hard. It still exposed plenty, but that's what made the omissions louder. It felt like watching someone open every door in a hallway except the one at the end, the one everyone's actually curious about. And when viewers pointed that out, the conversation changed tone. This wasn't about Diddy alone anymore. It became about the ecosystem around him, the power structures, the alliances, the names that only exist in whispers because speaking them out loud comes with consequences. That's where the public started to split. Some defended the documentary, saying it did enough, that it never claimed to expose everything, that expecting total transparency is unrealistic, that producers have to protect themselves legally. Others weren't buying it. They argued that if you market something as truth, selective truth is still manipulation. That cutting 7 powerful names isn't editing, it's rewriting history. And that protecting certain figures while scrutinizing others isn't justice. It's strategy. And strategy was the word that kept coming up. People began framing 50 Cent not as a whistleblower, but as a curator, someone who knows exactly how far to push without pushing himself into danger, someone who understands the rules of the game too well to pretend ignorance. That didn't make him wrong. It made him careful, but careful doesn't always mean honest. The internet started pulling old interviews, tweets, and stand-up clips, aligning them with the documentary's blind spots. The overlaps were uncomfortable. Katt had mentioned industry shields. The documentary displayed them without naming them. It was like watching a magician explain the trick halfway through, then stop before revealing the secret. And audiences hate that. Because once you sense control, you stop trusting the performance. The 7 missing names became more interesting than everything that made the final cut. People speculated endlessly about who they were, why they were removed, and what their inclusion would have changed. Entire threads were built around absence alone. That's how you know something landed wrong. Not when people argue about what's there, but when they obsess over what isn't. The most damning part wasn't that the names were cut. It was that nobody denied it. No producer came out to say, "That's not true." No explanation surfaced. No clarification about editorial decisions. Just silence. And silence, once again, spoke louder than footage. Katt Williams didn't say anything new. He didn't need to. His old words were doing the work for him. The industry didn't look exposed. It looked confirmed. Like someone finally held up a mirror and accidentally showed the fingerprints. The documentary still stands. It still circulates. It still sparks conversation. But now it carries an asterisk. A sense that the story you saw was curated to survive, not to detonate. And that's the tension that locked viewers in. Because if 7 powerful names were removed this time, once the missing names became the story, the internet did what it always does when it smells control. It turned into a forensic lab with Wi-Fi. Every frame got paused. Every line got replayed. People weren't watching the documentary anymore. They were auditing it. The tone shifted from wow to wait a minute. And that's the moment narratives start cracking. Memes did the early damage. Side-by-sides of teaser clips versus final cuts. Captions asking why certain connections evaporated between marketing and release. Jokes about documentaries needing a deleted scenes for lawyers section. It was funny until it wasn't, because the jokes kept landing on the same point. Omission doesn't feel accidental when it's consistent. Reaction channels multiplied like spores. Everyone suddenly had a list. Everyone had a theory. Some creators claimed insider whispers. Others leaned into timelines and public records, pointing out overlaps that the film never touched. The confidence was contagious. Even bad theories sounded good when the gaps were that obvious, and the comparisons went nuclear. People said this edit made Watergate look like a typo. Others joked it had the energy of a true crime episode that stops right before naming the suspect, because the suspect might sue. Someone said the whole thing felt like a museum tour where the guide whispers, "We don't talk about that wing." That line stuck because viewers could feel where the documentary slowed down. The pacing changed. The questions softened. The edges rounded off right when things should have gotten sharp. It was like watching a roller coaster climb, and then gently coast instead of dropping. The public outrage didn't explode all at once. It simmered. It simmered because people realized something worse than censorship was happening. Permission. Permission to tell a story only if it stays survivable. Permission to expose a figure but not the network around them. Permission to feel informed without being empowered. And that's when Katt Williams' prophecy energy went full superhero origin. Clips of him resurfaced everywhere. Not just the wild lines, the precise ones. The parts where he talked about how names never get named, how power moves quietly, how the loudest truths are the ones nobody repeats. The tone changed. People weren't laughing anymore. They were nodding. The phrase "he warned us" became a meme of its own. What really set things off was the silence from the production side. No interviews explaining editorial choices. No time constraints excuses. No carefully worded statements about legal boundaries. Nothing. And silence at that level doesn't read as humility. It reads as calculation. Fans noticed who stayed quiet too. Who didn't repost. Who avoided questions. Who suddenly talked about unrelated projects. The internet treats absence like a tell. And the tells were everywhere. Then came the wild analogies. People compared the edit to a chessboard, where the queen never moves. To a crime documentary that spends 3 episodes on the getaway car but never mentions who owned the house. To a magic trick that distracts you with pyrotechnics while the real switch happens behind the curtain. Every analogy made the same point. This wasn't a lack of information. It was a choice. The public debate fractured into camps. One side argued the film did what it could without self-destructing. That legal reality matters. That truth doesn't exist in a vacuum. That naming 7 powerful people could have killed the project entirely. The other side said that argument proved Katt's point. That if truth has to survive, it's already compromised. That documentaries marketed as fearless shouldn't arrive with safety rails welded on. That selective courage is still fear, and the tone got sharper. People started asking who those 7 names were. Not out of gossip, but out of logic. What categories do they fit? Industry? Finance? Media? Politics? And once you ask that, you start realizing how deep the web might actually go. Threads exploded with possibilities. Some names repeated across different posts. Patterns emerged. Coincidences stacked. Even skeptics admitted the omissions were conspicuous. You don't cut 7 powerful figures and expect nobody to notice. What shocked people most wasn't that names were removed. It was how cleanly they were erased. No hints, no shadows. No sources say. Just gone. As if the safest move wasn't a blur. But to pretend they never existed, that level of erasure requires coordination. And coordination implies agreement, which is where the outrage hardened. Because now the documentary didn't feel like an expose anymore. It felt like a negotiated settlement between truth and liability. A project that wanted the applause of bravery without the cost of consequences, and audiences hate being managed. They don't mind being entertained. They don't even mind being manipulated, as long as the manipulation is clever. But once they feel protected from the truth for their own good, resentment sets in. That resentment turned into distrust. Viewers said they'd never watch the genre the same way again. That every future documentary would feel like a highlight reel, not a reckoning. That once you know how much can be cut without explanation, you stop believing what remains. The irony was brutal. The documentary succeeded. It trended. It sparked conversation. It made noise. But it also proved Katt Williams' central claim without meaning to. That power decides the limits of exposure. And those limits are invisible until someone points them out. And now they've been pointed out. The absence of response from 50 Cent only added fuel. No denial, no clarification. No, we didn't have enough time. Just silence. And when someone with his reputation chooses silence, people assume the calculation has already been done. The audience didn't need confirmation anymore. They had pattern recognition. What started as curiosity hardened into conviction. Not conviction about guilt, conviction about protection, about how certain names don't travel on screen because they don't have to. Because their influence exists upstream, far from where cameras are allowed to linger. The 7 missing names became symbols. Not individuals, symbols of a ceiling the truth can't break through. A reminder that exposure has limits. And those limits aren't creative. They're contractual. By the time the memes cooled and the reaction videos slowed, something heavier replaced them. Distrust of the edit. Distrust of the narrative. Distrust of the promise that this was the full story. And that distrust didn't fade. It calcified. Because once audiences realize what can be removed without consequence, they start asking what else has been removed everywhere else. In other documentaries, in other stories, in other truths sold as complete. And that's when a scandal stops being about one film. It becomes about the system that made the edit feel necessary. And the system never likes being noticed. The real damage didn't happen on release day. It happened afterward, when the noise settled and people realized something important had shifted. The documentary didn't collapse. It didn't get pulled. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. But underneath, trust took a hit that doesn't show up in ratings charts. Because once people noticed the missing names, they couldn't unnotice them. The conversation moved from curiosity to recalibration. Viewers stopped asking what the documentary revealed and started asking what it protected. And protection is a dangerous word when you're dealing with something marketed as truth. It implies intention. It implies boundaries. It implies someone decided how far the audience was allowed to go. That's when 50 Cent's role started getting re-examined, not as a creator. As a gatekeeper, people began framing him less like a fearless exposer and more like a strategic editor. Someone who understands the system well enough to challenge it without triggering retaliation. Someone who knows exactly where the red lines are and stopped right before crossing them. That doesn't make him weak. It makes him realistic, but realism doesn't sit well with audiences who are promised revelation. The idea that 7 powerful names were cut didn't just raise eyebrows, it reframed the entire project. Suddenly, the documentary looked less like a spotlight and more like a flashlight pointed carefully away from certain corners. And once viewers feel guided instead of informed, skepticism replaces engagement. Katt Williams. Credibility skyrocketed without him saying a word. He didn't go on victory laps. He didn't repost clips.
He didn't claim validation.
He didn't have to. The moment did the work for him. His old warnings now played, like preloaded captions for everything people were seeing unfold. That's the irony. The industry tried to contain the truth. And in doing so, elevated the one voice they dismissed for saying it too early. People stopped calling him paranoid. They started calling him prophetic. And prophecy scares. Systems built on controlled narratives. The long-term consequence wasn't outrage, it was distance. Viewers didn't storm the gates. They didn't boycott. They disengaged mentally. They watched with suspicion instead of immersion. That shift is subtle, but it's lethal to trust-based storytelling. Every future documentary now feels suspect by default. People ask different questions while watching. Who's missing? Who benefits? Where does the story soften? Once those questions enter the viewing experience, the illusion never fully recovers. The 7 removed names became more powerful absent than they ever would have been present. They turned into symbols of influence that doesn't need screen time, of power that exists upstream. Untouched by narrative consequences, that realization hit hard because it suggested the truth doesn't stop at Diddy, it stops at influence. At money, at connections that don't want their fingerprints anywhere near controversy. Even indirectly. The documentary didn't lie. It just didn't finish the sentence. And unfinished sentences are dangerous because they invite speculation. Speculation grows legs. Legs walk into places the cameras never intended to follow. Industry insiders felt it too. The silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. When people don't rush to defend themselves, it usually means they're confident the system will hold. And the system often does, but not without. Losing something in the process. What it lost here was credibility, not in one blow. In 1,000 Quiet Doubts, the genre took a hit as well. True crime exposes. Industry tell-alls. They all rely on the promise that the camera will go where power doesn't want it to. When audiences realize there's a ceiling to that promise, those questions don't disappear. They follow the audience into the next documentary. And the next. The biggest consequence wasn't backlash. It was awareness. Awareness that exposure is curated. Awareness that truth is tiered. Awareness that some names never appear not because they're innocent, but because they're insulated. And insulation is power. The system didn't collapse after this documentary. It adjusted. It always does. But the audience adjusted too. And audiences that adjust their expectations are harder to manage. They don't react the same way. They don't suspend disbelief as easily. They don't accept silence as neutral. Katt Williams didn't win an argument, he won time. He said it early enough that when it finally became visible, people remembered who warned them. And being remembered for telling the truth before it was safe is more powerful than being praised for telling it. When it is, the documentary will continue to be watched. It will continue to trend. It will continue to spark conversation, but it will never be seen the same way again. Every cut feels intentional now. Every omission feels loud. Every silence feels negotiated. And that's the real aftermath. Not scandal. Not cancellation. Not outrage. Suspicion. Because once people understand how much can be removed without explanation, they stop believing they're ever seeing the full picture. And once that belief breaks, it doesn't come back quietly. Now it's your turn. Because if you stayed until this point, you're not just watching for entertainment. You're watching because something about this story doesn't sit right. 7 names don't disappear by accident. Silence doesn't happen without permission. And documentaries don't stop short unless someone told them exactly where to stop. So drop your real take in the comments. Not a safe one. Not the "it's complicated" one. Was this smart strategy by 50 Cent? Or proof that Katt Williams saw the system coming a mile away? Were those names removed to protect the project? Or to protect power? Say what you actually think. Because the comments section is where the uncensored version of this conversation lives. Now smash that like button like it owes you money. Skip town and left no forwarding address. Likes tell the algorithm this story isn't finished, and trust me, it's far from over. If you're new here, hit subscribe immediately. This channel doesn't just recap headlines. We decode patterns. We connect dots people pretend not to see. When something gets edited, erased, or quietly removed, we're already asking why. Turn on notifications too. Not later. Not when the next clip goes viral. Now, because scandals don't announce themselves. And the biggest revelations always show up disguised as nothing to see here. This isn't just commentary. This is investigative instinct with volume turned up. We don't just tell you what happened. We tell you what didn't happen, and why that matters more. So stay alert. Stay skeptical. Stay watching. Because if this moment proved anything, it's that the truth doesn't disappear. It just gets edited. And here, we always check the cuts. Welcome to Fame Blueprint, where power leaves patterns. And we trace every line.